Behind every product in your home lies a hidden journey, across oceans, borders, and invisible lines of politics. The coffee in your cup, the phone in your hand, even the shoes on your feet, they didn't just appear in a store. They traveled. They were taxed. They were fought over. Most of us don't think about it. We see a price tag, not the battlefield of policies and deals that set it. But trade and tariffs, those simple words we often tune out, shape our daily lives more than most realize. They decide what's affordable and what isn't, which industries thrive and which collapse, who keeps their job and who doesn't. Tonight we strip away the noise. No spin, no political slogans, just the facts. We'll trace how tariffs built America, how they nearly broke it, and how they still shape every paycheck, every grocery bill, and every business today. Because every headline about trade isn't really about governments or politicians. It's about you. And every price you pay tells a story, one that's written in tariffs. Think for a moment about the shirt on your back, the phone in your hand, the car you drive. Most of them didn't begin their lives in America. They came here, shipped across oceans, flown across skies, or carried over borders. This invisible movement of goods is what economists call trade, but for everyday Americans it simply means choice, availability, and affordability. The United States imports an enormous variety of goods. The clothes hanging in your closet, many stitched in Bangladesh or Vietnam, the smartphone you check 100 times a day, likely designed in California but assembled in China, the oil fueling your commute or heating your home, some pumped from American soil, but a great deal flowing in from Canada, Mexico, and beyond. But America doesn't just consume, it also creates and exports. U.S. Factories and farms send airplanes, medical equipment, and heavy machinery across the globe. Midwestern fields grow soybeans that end up in dinner bowls in Asia. Our tech companies supply software and chips that power the digital world. This flow is the bloodstream of the global economy. Imports allow Americans to buy affordable products. Exports keep American workers employed and industries competitive. When either side is disrupted, when tariffs rise, when borders tighten, when global politics shift, it's not just about governments. It's about your grocery bill, the price of gas, and the paycheck that comes home at the end of the week. Trade isn't abstract, it's personal. Every product tells a story, and many of those stories begin far from where they end. Now let's talk about the word you've heard 1,000 times in the news: tariffs. In plain English, tariffs are nothing more than border taxes. Imagine this. You find a pair of shoes you love online. They're listed at $100. But by the time they reach your doorstep, a tax has been added at the border, raising the price to $120. That extra $20 isn't profit for the store. It's a tariff, collected by the government. Why does this matter? Because tariffs change behavior. On the one hand, they can protect American jobs. If imported shoes from abroad become more expensive, maybe you'll buy a pair made in the U.S. instead. That's the logic behind tariffs. Shield domestic industries from cheaper competition. They also bring in revenue. Every tariff dollar collected adds to the federal treasury. In fact, before income taxes were introduced, tariffs were one of the primary ways America funded its government. But there's a catch. Those costs don't just vanish. They're passed on to consumers. Higher prices at checkout mean Americans shoulder the burden. Protecting one job in one industry may mean higher living costs for millions of households. So, tariffs are a balancing act. They can help industries survive and governments earn revenue. But they can also make everyday life more expensive. At their core, tariffs are less about numbers on a government ledger and more about the choices you and I face every day at the store. In the 1800s, America was young, ambitious, and still finding its economic footing. Back then, there was no federal income tax, no IRS collecting paychecks. Instead, the U.S. government funded itself largely through tariffs, taxes on imported goods. Every ship that docked at New York Harbor, every crate unloaded in Boston or Charleston, carried not just goods, but also the lifeblood of the American treasury. Tariffs kept the government running, paid for infrastructure, and allowed the nation to stand on its own 2 feet. But tariffs weren't only about money, they were about protection. America's industries were still infant industries. Steel mills, textile factories, and early manufacturers couldn't yet compete with the powerful economies of Britain or Europe. By raising tariffs, the U.S. government put up a shield, giving local businesses the breathing room to grow. It worked. Factories multiplied, jobs expanded, towns rose around industries that might have withered without protection. For nearly a century, tariffs were not just an economic policy, they were a cornerstone of the American identity. They represented self-reliance, resilience, and the belief that America could one day match the old powers of Europe. Tariffs, in those early years, were not walls to keep America out of the world. They were scaffolding, temporary structures meant to help a young nation rise. And rise it did. But what once built America could also hurt it. In 1930, at the height of economic fear, Congress passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. Its goal was to protect struggling American farmers and workers by making foreign goods more expensive. On paper, it seemed logical. Build higher walls, keep the competition out, save American jobs. The reality was devastating. Other nations struck back with tariffs of their own. Global trade slowed to a crawl. Farmers who once sold crops abroad suddenly found no buyers. Industries that depended on imported materials saw costs skyrocket. The world economy, already reeling from the stock market crash, sank deeper into despair. Historians still debate how much Smoot-Hawley worsened the Great Depression, but one truth is clear. Tariffs that were meant to protect ended up isolating America at the very moment the world most needed connection. The lesson was bitter, but unforgettable. Tariffs can build shields, yes, but when pushed too far, they can also build cages. Out of the ashes of World War II, the United States helped design a new global order. One built not on walls, but on windows. Trade became the cornerstone of peace and prosperity. Institutions like the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, and later the World Trade Organization, WTO, were created to lower barriers and encourage cooperation. The logic was simple. If nations traded with one another, they'd be less likely to fight one another. And so tariffs fell, treaties multiplied, and a new age of globalization began. In the 1990s, the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, tied the economies of the U.S., Canada, and Mexico closer together. Goods flowed faster and cheaper. Clothing from Asia filled shelves. Electronics became affordable for the average household. American corporations discovered they could outsource production to countries with lower wages, cutting costs, boosting profits, and fueling the rise of global supply chains. But while consumers benefited from cheaper products, not everyone won. Entire American towns dependent on manufacturing jobs began to decline. The same forces that lowered the price of a TV also shuttered factories and eroded communities. This era of free trade sowed both prosperity and resentment. For many, globalization meant abundance. For others, it meant loss. And in those losses lay the seeds of today's debates over tariffs and trade wars. In 2018, the quiet machinery of global trade jolted to a halt. President Donald Trump announced sweeping tariffs on China, hitting $360 billion worth of Chinese goods. From electronics to steel, furniture to auto parts, the prices of everyday products were suddenly pulled into a geopolitical storm. The move was framed as a long overdue correction. For decades, critics argued, China had undercut American industries, stolen intellectual property, and manipulated markets. Tariffs, Trump declared, would level the playing field and put America first. But trade is never a one-way street. China struck back with tariffs of its own, targeting U.S. agriculture and manufacturing. Soybeans, once a backbone of American exports, rotted in silos. Farmers who relied on selling crops overseas watched markets vanish overnight. Manufacturers faced rising costs as imported parts became more expensive. For consumers, the impact rippled through checkout aisles. A washing machine that once cost $800 might now cost $1,000. A company struggling with higher material costs might pass that burden on in hidden ways: smaller packaging, fewer jobs, or stagnant wages. The country was split. Supporters hailed Trump's tariffs as a bold defense of American workers, finally standing up to Beijing. Critics called it a self-inflicted wound, arguing the real victims were American farmers, families, and businesses. Tariffs, once an abstract policy, were now personal. They weren't just numbers on a government chart. They were the higher bill at Walmart, the unsold crops in Iowa, the layoff notices in Detroit. The trade war was not fought with bullets or bombs, but its battleground was every American home, every grocery cart, every small business ledger. And in this new war, victory was harder to define. When President Joe Biden took office, many expected a sharp reversal. But in trade, the shockwave didn't end. It settled into a new reality. Biden kept most of Trump's tariffs in place, signaling that this was no longer a partisan experiment. Tariffs had become a bipartisan tool. The Biden administration shifted the language. Instead of America first, the emphasis was on resilience, securing supply chains, protecting critical industries, and building independence in areas like semiconductors, renewable energy, and advanced technology. The logic was clear. The pandemic had exposed how vulnerable the U.S. was to global disruptions. A shortage of chips in Taiwan could idle entire auto plants in Michigan. A supply bottleneck in Asia could empty shelves in American supermarkets. Tariffs, in this context, weren't just punishment for rivals. They were a form of insurance, a way to encourage production at home and reduce reliance on unpredictable foreign suppliers. Yet the trade-offs remained: higher costs for businesses, higher prices for families, and lingering uncertainty for farmers and manufacturers caught in the crossfire. By keeping the tariffs, Biden underscored a new truth. The debate over trade wasn't just about politics anymore. It was about national security, economic survival, and the uneasy balance between globalization and independence. The trade wars had begun with confrontation, but under Biden, they had evolved into something else: a long game of endurance. Every war has its winners and losers, even a trade war. On one side, the steel industry found a lifeline. For decades, cheap foreign steel had flooded U.S. markets, forcing mills to close and hollowing out once thriving towns. Tariffs on imported steel gave domestic producers breathing room. A few factories reopened. Some workers put their hard hats back on. Politicians pointed to these jobs as proof that tariffs worked. But those gains were scattered, and the costs spread much further. For every job saved in steel, industries that used steel paid the price. Car manufacturers, construction companies, and appliance makers all saw costs rise. A washing machine that once cost $800 shot up by nearly $200 within months. And for the average family, that price hike wasn't just a statistic. It was the difference between replacing a broken appliance now or putting it off until later. Farmers, too, bore the brunt. When China and other countries retaliated, American soybeans, pork, and dairy lost their buyers. Silos filled with unsold crops. Family farms, already operating on razor-thin margins, faced bankruptcy. Washington sent billions in aid. But for many farmers, it felt like being paid to stand still while markets slipped away forever. Small businesses felt trapped in a game they didn't choose. Retailers importing goods for holiday sales saw shipments stuck in customs, slapped with sudden fees they hadn't budgeted for. Owners had to make impossible choices: raise prices, cut staff, or absorb losses. Tariffs at their core weren't just about numbers on an economic chart. They were about lives, about whether a family could afford groceries, whether a farmer could keep land passed down for generations, whether a small shop could survive another year. In the grand debate of policy, the most important story often goes untold. The everyday Americans carrying the weight of decisions made far above them. Trade wars don't stay within borders. The moment America raises a tariff, the echo is heard across oceans. Allies like Canada and the European Union found themselves unexpectedly in the crosshairs. When U.S. tariffs targeted steel and aluminum, Canada retaliated with its own measures. European leaders, too, bristled at what felt less like partnership and more like hostility. The disputes strained relationships built over decades of trust. For nations long considered friends, the question became unavoidable. If the U.S. could slap tariffs on allies just as quickly as on rivals, what did that say about the reliability of American leadership? Globally, the ripple spread to supply chains. A tariff on Chinese electronics didn't just affect Beijing. It disrupted manufacturers in Germany, South Korea, and Mexico that relied on those parts. The web of globalization meant that every tug on one strand shook the entire net. America's decisions were no longer just national policies. They were global signals, shaping how countries aligned, invested, and planned for the future. A tariff wasn't just a tax, it was a message. We will protect ourselves, even if you're an ally. And those messages left scars. Trust once broken is slow to heal. If this helped you see the bigger picture behind the headlines, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Politics Unpacked, because the more clearly we understand the choices being made for us, the better prepared we are to face the price of protection.